Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining, and we will be with you shortly. Thank you all for joining us today for the Center for Progressive Reform's webinar, Power to the People, Advancing Energy Equity in North Carolina and Beyond. Thank you for being here today. Some general housekeeping. If you have any problems with the webinar audio, you can join by phone at the following number or via the webinar ID listed here. All participants will be muted during the webinar. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. Your questions will be visible to the moderator and the presenters only. The webinar is being recorded and will be shared after the event, and members of the press may be joining today's webinar. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Center for Progressive Reform. The Center for Progressive Reform harnesses the power of law and public policy to create a responsive government, a healthy environment, and a just society. The center envisions a government that uses the full force of its power to curb climate change and ensure a sustainable environment, economic justice, and healthy workplaces and communities for all. Today, we would like to define some terms in a general sense for today's presentation. So in this webinar, you will hear customer-owned generation in the form of residential and community solar. Customer-owned generation can take many forms, including solar panels installed directly onto a residential property. This is known as residential solar. In this webinar, you will also hear reference to community solar. Community solar captures solar energy from offsite sources. It helps renters, large groups, businesses, and nonprofit organizations access solar energy through a subscription service. We would now like to welcome our presenters today. First, Ajulo Othow, CPR board member and founder and CEO, EnerWealth Solutions and the law offices of Ajulo E. Othow. Also, Emily Hammond, CPR member scholar and professor and vice provost, George Washington University Law School. And Joseph Tomain, CPR member scholar and professor and dean of the University of Cincinnati College of Law. And now we would like to talk a little bit about our white paper launching next week, bringing us here today. The center launches its brief next week, Power to the People, Advancing Energy Equity via Customer-Owned Electricity Generation, which focuses on North Carolina, a state that has so far failed to make good on its tremendous potential to convert energy from the sun into electricity for the public, particularly in marginalized communities. This brief is aimed at people who advocate for energy equity in North Carolina, as well as concerned citizens facing rising electricity prices as the state decarbonizes. This brief also has value for those advocating for customer-owned generation in other states. The Center for Progressive Reform is calling on North Carolina to enact a suite of policy reforms that help low-wealth people generate their own electricity by installing solar panels on their properties or subscribing to community solar programs. Doing so, center scholars and staff argue, will advance energy equity. The principle that people who are the most harmed by inequitable energy systems and infrastructure are able to participate in and benefit from a fairer energy system as the state transitions to a clean energy economy. The center makes this call in our brief, which defines customer-owned generation for lay audiences, explains how customer-owned generation differs from dirty energy generated by utility companies, and how it benefits structurally marginalized communities, including low-wealth people, communities of color, and people in rural areas. We also identify legal and policy opportunities to advance it, as well as list concrete actions that law and policymakers can take to support customer-owned generation. You will now hear from Ajulo Othow, who will speak on the energy landscape in North Carolina, including why customer-owned solar generation offers a strong solution to energy inequity statewide. As a co-author of the white paper, Ajulo will also share some of the main recommendations and findings from the report. I now turn to Ajulo.
Thank you so much, Sophie. And thank you to my fellow panelists for joining me today, and to all of the audience out there listening. I'm a business owner based in North Carolina, focused on distributed generation and rural development. Our goal here is not to villainize the incumbent utility, but to seek ways to help it and our state move forward together. We actually have only one goal. That is fair access to a technology that can result in less carbon emissions and greater resilience for families in North Carolina. While we know there is an impending wave of resources from the federal government to help us achieve this goal, there is also an uneven patchwork of rules and incentives across the country. And unfortunately, in North Carolina today, our policy environment does little to enable fair access to solar energy for everyday people, all of whom could benefit from less carbon and more bill savings. Please advance the slide. According to our state energy office, 1.5 million North Carolinians are energy burdened. That is nearly 14% of our fellow North Carolinians. These are seniors, moms, working people who struggle to pay their electric bill. And that is within the context of double-digit rate increases year over year. Helping more people, especially low-income people, access this technology and save is important to do, and it is entirely possible to do. Nearly 30% of Duke Energy's customers qualify as low income. That is a family of 4 making less than $55,000 per year. In our paper, Power to the People, we look specifically at community solar as one of the most equity-aligned strategies to achieve fair access. Through community solar, we have the ability to help all North Carolinians, not just those who own their homes and have suitable rooftops, but renters, those in manufactured housing and those in public housing, for whom even a marginal savings can have enormous impact given their relative income. These are families who may spend 10% or more of their income on their electric bill. Advance the slide. Ironically, the places with the highest energy burden in our state are also the places with the highest concentration of solar energy production in our state. Of course, there are many good technical reasons for that, but the symbolic juxtaposition should actually lead us to a certain understanding and a clear set of questions. It is also leading people within those communities to ask the question, what is solar and how exactly does it benefit me? And if the answer remains, it doesn't directly benefit me, the entire industry, including utility scale developers, are at risk. The fairness question is simply, how can everyday working people, working families access this technology in order to realize its benefits? This at a time when it's cheaper and cheaper, and when the federal government has directed hundreds of billions of dollars for greater access for everyday working families. By boosting incentives for smaller system sizes, by allocating enhanced tax credits for solar that feeds on-site load, for workers through prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, and towards low-income, coal-affected, and environmental justice communities, and bonus credit for new market entrants. In order for our state to leverage these investments, we need a level marketplace. And we have outlined a set of recommendations for North Carolina's lawmakers to consider. Please advance the slide. The first recommendation is to preserve net metering incentives. This is actually situated within a broader recommendation to ensure an accurate and comprehensive quantitative valuation of the grid level benefits of distributed generation, including carbon reduction goals. The second is to incentivize people with low wealth to generate their own electricity. Through community solar programs that can deliver at least 20% in bill savings for all subscribers, especially low-income ratepayers who struggle with affordability and routinely face shutoffs. And the third recommendation is to create the structural conditions for a thriving marketplace. This includes a regional market that is inclusive of independent power producers and permits third-party sales direct to consumers. We all know that competition can improve quality and drive down prices. We encourage you to read our recommendations and supporting analysis in full in Power to the People. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ajulo. We will now hear from Joe Tomain on connecting the dots between state and federal levels. Joseph Tomain is also a contributor to the CPR White Paper. Joe, I turn to you.
Thank you very much. I am going to make 3 points, and I will echo some of the remarks that Ajulo made. Let me give you 3 reasons for community ownership of generation. One is energy democracy, and by energy democracy, I mean several things. First, it's the idea that a technology of producing electricity is scaled to the tasks before it. There is no real reason that you need large central power stations to heat up the tea kettle on your stove, for example. So technology can be scaled down and scaled to task. Additionally, community ownership by its very definition means that it's locally owned. And then following that, community-owned generation means that it's also going to be operated and managed locally. So you have decentralization through community projects, as well as self-government and self-determination. All of those are elements of energy democracy, and that is, I think, a primary reason for thinking about this as an alternative to traditional utility generation and distribution. Second point is that community ownership is absolutely consistent with clean energy policy. Now, where do you find clean energy policy? We have close to 50 years now, 40 plus years, of the federal government encouraging small power production and alternative sources. It comes in a legislation called the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act of 1978, and it's scattered through other legislation that has been passed both before and since PURPA. So we do have a clean energy policy. However, at the federal level, we have not aggressively pursued it as strongly as we might. We have, however, at the state and local level, seen a great series of initiatives. And I know that there's a research center in North Carolina, EnerWealth, that collects this data. It's a fabulous resource for anyone interested in finding out what any state in the country is doing relative to climate change, decarbonization, and clean energy. And the final reason for a consistency with clean energy policy is that the market is going there. We have seen any number of entrepreneurs, innovators trying to get into the electricity market. There is cheaper electricity to be had in the market. There are any number of providers. Ajulo referenced independent power producers. There is any number of distributed generation projects where things get caught in a little bit of a blockade is access to the grid. And this has been a problem that's been ongoing for at least 4 decades, but it's soluble. This is not an unsolvable problem. But community ownership is completely consistent with clean energy policy. The third point I want to make echoes a little bit of the last point about private activity in clean energy markets, and that is there are lots of opportunities for public-private energy initiatives, whether it's third-party sales, third-party financing, partnerships between traditional utilities and distributed generation projects. So if you look at energy democracy, clean energy policy, public-private initiatives, I think you'll find that community ownership is absolutely consistent with each of those elements. Now, here's the last point I want to make. It is also the case that this challenges the traditional central power station model that is often based on cost to service rate making. That model has to change. It has served the country extraordinarily well, particularly throughout most of the 20th century. It's now time for us to rethink that model, move away from traditional rate making, move away from completely regulating and rewarding utilities for building more. We ought to think about decoupling some of the utility projects. For example, there is no reason why utilities can't operate solar and wind farms not as regulated entities, but as for-profit revenue streams in their own businesses, and start to get away from a dependence on ratepayers for all of their energy projects. In addition, it's necessary for the traditional model to pay more attention to climate change and the environment. These are things that have been going on for decades, but community ownership is one project that in fact speaks to all of those. So I'm happy to answer questions should you have them.
Thank you so much, Joe. We'll now hear from Emily Hammond on what programs at the national level may support the adoption of customer-owned solar generation in North Carolina and beyond. Emily, I turn to you.
Hi, thanks. And can everyone hear me okay? Great. Well, it's great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the questions and engaging with my co-panelists. So one of the things that I think is very apparent from the report that we're discussing is how much a state's rate structure and the regulated status of utilities can really impact the viability of community solar, especially for low-income households. It's very disappointing to see that the Public Utilities Commission in North Carolina just last week approved a rate structure for Duke that is going to make it really hard for low-income households to actually see a financial benefit from participating in community solar. That said, I thought that I would provide some of the landscape for programs that are federally funded, but that means there's funding in North Carolina to make some inroads. And since this is about energy equity, I also will talk about a few things, not just community solar. So of course, I'm sure everybody on this call is familiar with Justice 40 and the idea that 40% of the benefits of climate initiatives, federally funded ones, should go to what they call disadvantaged communities. And so if we're talking about what are those climate initiatives and what are some of those benefits available, there's a lot of federal programs, a few that I thought I'd highlight today. One is the Department of Energy's Community Solar Partnership. Earlier this year, the department launched a $10 million prize to accelerate community solar that serves at least 40% of low-income customers. They provide free technical assistance. They promote and help develop credit-ready projects that can connect investors to funding in these disadvantaged communities. And there are various banks and philanthropic organizations that have already committed about $5 billion to this. There's also an online platform to connect developers and communities. And then we already heard mentioned as well, of course, related to this, the Inflation Reduction Act has great tax credits right now for developers of solar, with a 20% bonus to those who sell to low-income households. What's the big stumbling block for North Carolina? Well, this whole thing is really structured best for independent power producers or independent developers to create these projects. And of course, third-party sales are not allowed in North Carolina. Now, I think that the municipal co-ops could do this work. And so this is a place of opportunity to put pressure on those institutions or those utilities to take advantage of some of the funding that's available right now. Another thing I really wanted to highlight is the way community solar and access to it can be braided together with other services. And an important one is the Weatherization Assistance Program. That's also administered by Department of Energy, but it's administered in North Carolina through the Department of Environmental Quality. That's the state energy agency. So here, just to give you a sense of things, in 2020, there was about a $310 million appropriation nationwide for this work. And that involved retrofitting about 35,000 homes. Under the bipartisan infrastructure law, that number has increased to $3.5 billion. So there's a lot of money available. There are a number of hurdles, I think, for home dwellers who would like to undertake weatherization. And I see this as a huge opportunity for law schools, legal clinics, other providers of legal services to low-income communities to really help people navigate this kind of overwhelming and intimidating system, to help people actually weatherize their homes so that they can get both the benefits of energy savings through efficiency measures and through hopefully savings through participation in community solar. North Carolina does have a program in place to put together community solar and weatherization assistance. What I understand is that there have been 3 projects to do this thus far. They're all the co-ops. They're not Duke projects. But another opportunity right now, the Department of Environmental Quality is collecting comments on their 5-year plan for weatherization assistance. And again, a huge opportunity to make these points that we're talking about today and to make additional points about making it easier to access these kinds of services. But once again, this kind of program counts for Justice 40. So there's a huge level of support right now. It's a moment of opportunity at the federal level in terms of putting pressure on the states to meet the Justice 40 requirements in order to bring funding into the states. So I can talk a little bit more about what some of the features of the program are if people would like to do that. But I did just want to highlight there's quite a lot going on that can be put together for energy equity. Even though in North Carolina, at least right now, we do have these constraints with how the rate making structure impacts the affordability of community solar. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you to all of our presenters today. We'd now like to invite you all to drop your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will go ahead and begin the Q&A portion of this webinar. We will start with our first question, which is, I was wondering how much thinking has been done around the current IRA funding streams and how they could promote community solar. I was particularly thinking of the federal GHG reduction fund and the direct payments for not-for-profits installing solar or battery systems. Whichever presenter would like to answer that, feel free.
We are at the very beginning of that process, and hopefully we'll be in a position to fully take advantage of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund through the North Carolina Clean Energy Fund, which is our green bank, but also through some of the existing CDFIs and credit unions in the state to help access those. Many of those, though, have not done any clean energy lending so far. And so there is a sort of steep learning curve. And then couple that with limited pipeline on the market side of things. I do think we'll get there, but it will, I think, take some time. But that's exactly the right question I think we should be asking, Louise.
Thank you, Ajulo. We have a question for Joe. What would it look like in North Carolina exactly if Duke were allowed to operate wind and solar in an unregulated manner? Would we need a wholesale market? For example, a regional transmission organization?
Okay, so I can't speak with great detail as to North Carolina, so I'll try to answer that more generally. I should say that the president of Duke, North Carolina, or Carolinas, was a student of mine. So I think very highly of her, and maybe we could talk to her. I don't know that you necessarily need a new RTO. There's no reason not to join the existing one. What was the first part of the question? I'm sorry, I was getting unmuted.
That's okay. What would it look like in North Carolina exactly if Duke were allowed to operate wind and solar in an unregulated manner?
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you very much. I really love this question in the following sense. The last comment I made was, I see no reason why you can't have a utility operate wind and solar projects, take them off the regulated side of the books, and compete in the marketplace. There's no economic reason not to do that. There are political reasons. The political reason is that these are incumbents, and the incumbents have the ear of the regulators. But can just think about that as a model. Let the utility compete, as opposed to saying, oh, we'll provide wind and solar, but you're going to have to pay every penny of it. And there's no reason for them to reduce costs that way. You can come up with a rate scheme that may help do that, but I think the cleaner way is just take it off the regulated books. I know of no proposals to do that, but I think it makes all the sense in the world that utilities have to think of a new way of doing business. In other words, join the competitive world.
Thank you, Joe. Our next question, could you explain more about third-party sales and give an example of a state where they are allowed?
I can take that one. In the solar context, basically, we're talking about a company that would undertake the investment and usually also the construction and operation of a solar facility, and then it would partner right with users of the solar energy usually, and then instead of the user directly getting that electricity, essentially they would be buying the electricity from that installer and operator under what's called a power purchase agreement, or a PPA. There is a map on through Desire, if you Google that, of third-party solar PV power purchase agreement policies across the US. About 29 states plus DC currently authorize those. North Carolina, of course, does not. But you can certainly look at this map and see that some of the states where we have really great examples of community solar, California, for example, Massachusetts, they also have these third-party sales.
Thank you. Our next question, to Emily again. Can you clarify about tax credits under the IRA? An individual can use the 30% tax credit and a business or nonprofit can use the bonus credits up to 70%. So we don't have to wait for Duke or the co-ops. Is that right?
So I think that the distinction here, and I am not a tax attorney and I have not read the tax code. So I will leave it to individuals to do their research if that's what they're looking for. But I was talking here about developers of solar, not necessarily like an individual who would put solar panels on their home, or a business or nonprofit that would install solar panels for their own use. So here I'm talking about the developers. Actually, probably it would be people like I just described, right? The companies that would invest, install, and maybe operate solar facilities. So that's where I think that the tax credit that I was mentioning would apply, like for community solar.
Awesome, thank you.
And Sally, just to add to that, you're correct that we don't have to wait for Duke to access those tax credits. The IRA includes a ability to transfer those tax credits where there's no liability that residential folks can use. And then there's a direct pay portion that nonprofits can use where there's no tax liability. And if you build a system yourself, you can take the 30% credit. If it is third-party owned through the business investment portion of the tax code, that's where you begin to see the adders and bonuses add up. So this would be a developer that owns the system and maybe leases it to a commercial property, owns the system and engages in some sort of other, again, our third-party sales prohibition is a little bit of a constraint to actually being able to maximize the adders and the bonus portions of the credit. Of course, if you're a developer and you own the site and you sell the power to Duke Energy, the site is located possibly in a low income or environmental justice community, you may be able to get the adder that way. So if you own it and consume it, you're eligible for the 30%. If you own it and in some way transact it to another entity, then you begin to see the adders and bonuses stack up. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Ajulo. Our next question is part logistic. Yes, the paper will be sent out to all participants. And the second part, does the paper include references to the role of city block microgrids as energy resource aggregators to create income streams for the city block community? No, it does not, but any panelists want to speak to city block microgrids?
I have some colleagues working on that, but I'm not aware of any papers they have yet published about that work. So we'll have to, I'll save anything for maybe a next time.
Yeah, great question. We'll have to do some research. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. Our next question is, what steps should North Carolina take to develop a competitive generation market where community solar could operate?
Maybe I'll just suggest, and my fellow panelists, I'd love to know if you disagree with this. I mean, I think a first step is getting rid of that third-party purchase or third-party sale prohibition, because frankly, if you could do that chipping away at the overall regulated status of North Carolina, you could get very far to enabling these kinds of projects. It's a whole different thing to completely deregulate the retail market, which some states have done, but comes with a lot of growing pains and a lot of structural considerations. So I just think the first step is that third-party sale prohibition.
I completely agree with Emily. And one of the things that I find curious on this issue of third-party sales and third-party financing is I can't imagine that residential citizens are the only people that would like this. I can't see why a college wouldn't, a manufacturing firm wouldn't, an industrial complex wouldn't, any number of communities wouldn't. So the question in my mind is, where is the coalition building that goes to the point that say we as consumers and citizens find this a very attractive option? I just don't know enough North Carolina politics to that, and maybe Ajulo, you can help us out. Is there a possibility of such coalition building on this issue?
Yes, absolutely. And this isn't the first time we've gone down this road. And in fact, NC Warren and Sally worked several years ago to challenge the third-party sales prohibition by installing a system on the rooftop of a church in Greensboro, and challenged it through our appellate court process. And our appellate court was very clear that the law does not allow it. So it is statutory, and that's where the change would need to be made. I think the other way that North Carolina could encourage community solar is, or at least have meaningful impact, is in the price or the value of the electricity that's generated from the array, so that there is some bill savings for the subscriber. Otherwise, this remains a premium product that people will do for other reasons, non-economic reasons, and that just is not a solution for low wealth people, working families.
Thank you, Ajulo. We have another question. Can you say more about how we can help low wealth ratepayers afford renewable energy? What are the methods of financing?
Well, if there were third-party sales, and that is a huge if, a developer or owner of the PV array could basically sell the electricity per kilowatt hour, just like the utility does, at a rate less than what the utility does. It's very simple. It's a very simple math. In the absence of that, we need to think about incentives to help low wealth ratepayers to pay a lease or to pay for the system up front. There is the barrier that folks may not have a suitable roof, which is a huge barrier. And hopefully community solar, if it were a meaningful program, could address that.
Yeah, I'll jump in too. Sometimes through the weatherization assistance program, renewable energy can be an option, but I think, Ajulo, you really hit the nail on the head. It's such a limited group of people who might be able to do that. One is we're talking about generally a single family home or manufactured housing in those kinds of situations, which a lot of low wealth people don't have access to. If you're a renter and not an owner, then your landlord has to be on board with it. And so again, this is why community solar is such a place of potential for providing that access, because it avoids the issues that one might find where somebody is living, and still gives the availability of ideally lower electricity rates. And I will say there are lots of in states where this is working really well, the access to community solar is highly subsidized. People can qualify to access it without having to pay buy-in costs, which otherwise is typically a feature of community solar. So there still is, right, an initial hurdle to get involved in one, and there are subsidies available, but they have to be available.
Thank you, Emily. Next question for any of the panelists. Are there any models out there that North Carolina can learn from?
I think the first place I'd look is the resource that we mentioned earlier, the Desire website out of North Carolina, DSIRE. They will have a complete list of state programs.
Could I add a really nice, very recent, great example is on the Department of Energy's website. It's the Sunny Awards for Equitable Community Solar. They just awarded that to 5 projects, and you could look at those and really see all the things and policies that can come together to create really model programs.
And we don't have to look too far. We can look to our southern neighbors, South Carolina and Florida, both of which had pretty robust community solar programs. And the South Carolina program, I think, is very instructive for North Carolina in that it is a Duke program that is specifically for low-income community solar. It's called the Shared Solar for Income Qualified Customers, based in South Carolina, operated by Duke Energy, and it guarantees a savings for low-income subscribers. We don't have to look that far to find models.
Thank you all. Our next question is more a statement, but it sounds like the problem in North Carolina is political, getting the law changed. Not that there are not solutions out there if we can get the laws changed.
I said to my kids at dinner last night, when I was sort of telling them about what this was going to be, and some of their family is in North Carolina, I just said, North Carolina is leaving so much money on the table. I mean, there's so many really good reasons to do this that aren't about money for a state, but good gracious, I see it as the legal barriers.
Thank you. So just kind of another sort of counter argument. So some might say that cross subsidization could be a huge concern. What do you say?
Well, my position on cross subsidization is it's overstated. I think every single project is going to have to go through its own sort of economics and finance. But think about this, that community solar has both reduced costs and benefits that aren't available if you continue to be connected to the traditional utility. And so let me talk a little bit about costs. Again, this is going to be project by project, and I understand CPR is going to do a little deeper dive into the cost picture. But if you're a community solar project, you own the land, whereas the utility, if they want to build a new project, they buy the land and the ratepayers have to pay for it. I'd rather own it and have it as an asset of some sort. What is the cost of wind and energy? Zero. Obviously, you have to build the ability to convert solar and wind into electricity, but the cost of energy itself is zero. So you have a reduced cost there. If you have projects that are reduced in scale, which is to say that you're not running lengthy distribution and transmission lines, you've reduced the cost of not only building new generation, but delivering it to the end user. So you have reduced costs there. You are not also building excess capacity necessarily at the same scale that a utility is. So you have reduced generation costs. Add to that, that you, as a community project, you can, if you're connected to the grid, you're adding value to the grid. You are adding value in terms of helping them balance their load, which is a very tricky proposition, but it's done every second of every day. And that if you can reduce load, you can reduce the peak, the cost of peak electricity, you can reduce cost of electricity to all users. That's one benefit. If you're decentralized, you're also increasing grid security and you're increasing both responsiveness and resilience. These are all assets that distributed generation, i.e. community-owned solar, adds to the entire electric system. So it seems to me that these economic benefits are real. Again, it will depend upon how they work out on each project, but the fact that those variables are part of the equation sort of is it one of the indicators is, as Emily just said, hey, you're leaving a lot of money on the table. There are people that want to get into this game in North Carolina, and those are the reasons they want to get into the game, because there's economic value to be realized.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think the rolling blackouts were a big wake-up call for many folks in North Carolina about just how vulnerable we are to natural hazards, and how vulnerable our grid is, and our inability to really predict the impact when we've got to transfer natural gas through pipes to get to homes. And I wanted to just paste in here an article from CNN they did last year about a community that weathered Hurricane Ian in Florida. And the system that was built was actually built by Florida Power and Light. They own the solar array. It was one of the few places that were able to weather the hurricane in Florida. And in fact, folks came from neighboring towns to this particular community because they still had the lights on.
Thank you, Ajulo. Emily, any final thoughts on cost issues?
No, I think it's been said very well.
Okay, excellent. Well, that concludes this portion of the webinar. And as we wrap up, I'm going to go ahead and share our slide for contact information. Please stay tuned for our white paper to arrive in your inboxes next week. And feel free to email myself, and I can pass that along to any of our panelists here. If you have any further questions, comments, or just want to chat about customer-owned solar generation, we're here for you. Thank you all for being here today, and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.